She stood in court accused like a criminal, but what no one knew was that she commanded the nation's top law enforcement agency. So why was the head of Homeland Security handcuffed in her own neighborhood and mocked by the very officers she oversees? If that makes you stop and think, hit the like button, share this story with someone who still believes in justice, and stay with me because what happened next turned an ordinary trial into a national reckoning. The hallways of Marston County Courthouse carried a quiet murmur, soft footsteps on polished stone, the occasional rustle of paper muffled conversations from behind wooden doors. Just another Tuesday, it seemed, but not to everyone. By the double doors leading to courtroom 3B, two uniformed officers stood with arms crossed and smirks loaded. Sergeant Kyle Mercer, thick-necked and seasoned in arrogance, leaned toward the younger man beside him. Officer Brent Dalton, 30 trim eyes sharp with misplaced confidence. She thinks she's somebody, Mercer muttered, nodding toward the entrance. That suit's not going to help her in jail. Dalton chuckled under his breath. Probably practiced her lines in the mirror. Bet she thinks she's in a documentary. The heavy doors creaked open. Dr. Nadine Rhodes stepped inside. She didn't storm in. She didn't flinch. She simply walked tall, composed a tailored navy blue suit hugging her frame like polished steel. Her chin was lifted, her gaze steady yet distant. There was nothing theatrical about her. And somehow that made her presence feel even bigger. She approached the security checkpoint. Ahead of her, a white man in a gray blazer was waved through with a nod and a lazy smile. No bag check, no questions. But as Nadine reached the scanner, the guard held out a hand. "Step back, ma'am," he said curtly. "Remove your shoes and walk through again." Nadine paused just for a moment. Her eyes flicked toward the other man, now halfway down the corridor, then down to the polished floor. She didn't argue. Wordlessly, she removed her heels and stepped barefoot through the scanner. No beep, of course. She slipped her shoes back on with quiet precision. Across the hall, Mercer's grin widened. "They always look calm at first," he said under his breath, "until reality hits." Dalton added, "Better hope the judge isn't swayed by confidence." At that moment, in a row of wooden benches to the left, an elderly black man in a tan overcoat shifted forward, eyes narrowed. Beside him, a young woman clutched her purse tighter, watching Nadine with a mix of hope and dread, like someone praying this time might be different. Inside courtroom 3B, the mood was almost indifferent. A few spectators typed quietly on phones. A court reporter arranged her notes. One man dozed with a newspaper folded on his lap. The name on the docket, State of Georgia, v. Nadine Rhodes, was just another line in a long list of cases that day. Nothing to draw attention. But when Nadine entered, something in the air changed. She didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the curious glances. She moved with quiet certainty to the defense table, where her attorney, Jonathan Ellery, a silver-haired man in a charcoal suit, rose to greet her with a slight bow and pulled her chair out gently. She sat without a word, opened a folder, adjusted a single page. Mercer, now seated with the prosecution, watched her closely. There was something in her stillness that unnerved him. He couldn't name it, but he didn't like it. Dalton whispered, "She's acting like she owns the place." Mercer didn't respond. He just clenched his jaw. The bailiff called for order. The judge hadn't even entered yet. And still without raising her voice or pointing a single finger, Nadine Rhodes had shifted the balance in the room. Something about her refused to shrink, and that refusal was louder than any outburst. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that the woman they planned to humiliate today might be the one person in this courthouse more powerful than them all. They just didn't know it yet. The courtroom settled as the bailiff called for order. Wood creaked heels, shuffled whispers died out like candles in a sudden wind. Judge Maureen Whitfield entered, her gaze steady but unreadable. She scanned the room with practiced neutrality until her eyes briefly landed on the defendant. Then a blink, a pause so slight most missed it. "Prosecution," she said. Assistant District Attorney Hannah Carville stood with brisk confidence. Slim, sharp-featured, every inch of her posture announced control. She clasped her hands before the jury and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple. It's not about race, it's not about politics, it's about interference." Why, she let the word hang. Carville took a few steps, not pacing, but moving with precision. She asked questions. She refused to back down. She caused confusion. That confusion gave the suspect time to flee. That's obstruction, that's recklessness, that's criminal. She turned her head toward Nadine, but did not use her name. No one, no matter how educated, how polished, or how important they believe they are, is above the law. Nadine did not blink. The room absorbed her stillness, like a sponge waiting for her to react, to flinch, to crack. She did none of that. She simply sat with her hands lightly folded on the table, eyes lowered just enough to be unreadable, not submissive. Across the aisle, Sergeant Mercer leaned toward Dalton and muttered with a grin, "Let's see how long Miss Homeland behaves like she's at a press conference." Dalton grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Jonathan Ellery, Nadine's attorney, remained still beside her, elbows lightly on the desk, fingertips together, as if meditating instead of defending someone accused. Carville pressed on. "You'll see body cam footage. You'll hear from both officers. You'll hear exactly how a civilian's misplaced boldness jeopardized a months-long operation." She gave one final look to the jury. This wasn't curiosity, it was defiance, and defiance has consequences. Then she sat, eyes cool and certain. For a moment there was no sound, just the creak of a chair somewhere in the back row. A few jurors shifted, trading uncertain glances. One woman scribbled something quickly. Another, a middle-aged black man in the third seat, stared not at Carville but at Nadine. His expression was complicated, conflicted. Because Nadine didn't look like someone on trial. She looked like someone watching the trial unfold. Jonathan leaned over and said something low in her ear. She gave a small, slow nod, then turned the page in her file without a sound. In the gallery, a reporter from the Marston Tribune scribbled, "Why does the accused act like she already knows the outcome?" Judge Whitfield adjusted her glasses slightly, then glanced once more at the defense table, and for the first time that morning, her face didn't hide its curiosity. Something unspoken shifted in the air. The story had begun, yes, but it was clear this wasn't going to be the story Carville had planned to tell. Not by a long shot. When the judge invited the defense to begin, Jonathan Ellery stood slowly. His presence wasn't commanding, but deliberate. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clean, like a quiet knife through thick fabric. "Your Honor," he began, "with the court's permission, we'd like to introduce video footage taken from a residential security camera in the Westwood neighborhood, timestamp March 3rd at 6:47 p.m. Judge Whitfield gave a slight nod. The lights dimmed. All eyes turned to the overhead screens mounted on either side of the courtroom. The video was grainy black and white. The camera, fixed to the corner of a modest home, looked out onto a quiet suburban street. Nothing remarkable: a row of hedges, a single tree, a child's scooter leaned up against a porch. Then flashing lights. 5 patrol cars came into frame, lining the curb like an invading force. Uniformed officers milled about. Some spoke into radios. Others stood near the doors, hands hovering near their belts. The energy was tense but directionless. No suspect in view, no commotion, just presence. Then from the left side of the screen, Nadine appeared. Dressed casually, jeans, a long coat, hair pulled back. She was walking a small dog on a leash. Her posture was relaxed, but her pace slowed as she approached the cars. She looked around, puzzled. Then she approached an officer. The camera didn't catch who, and gestured with her hand. There was no shouting, no aggressive movement, only conversation. Then, without warning, her arms were grabbed from behind. Another officer moved in quickly. Nadine stumbled slightly. Her hands were wrenched behind her back. She looked stunned, not combative. The dog pulled back on the leash, confused. One of the officers yanked it from her grasp, and then Nadine was shoved forward. Her body slammed against the hood of a patrol car. Gasps broke out in the courtroom. The footage froze on that moment. Her face turned sideways on cold metal hands cuffed tight behind her. Jonathan's voice returned calm and unshaken. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you've just seen is not interference, it's not aggression, it's not obstruction." He looked toward them. "It's a woman asking, 'What's going on in my neighborhood?' and being arrested for it." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Someone whispered, "That's not obstruction?" Another voice, softer. She wasn't even raising her voice. One juror, an older woman with silver hair and pearl earrings, let out a quiet sigh and rubbed her forehead. The youngest juror, a man in his late 20s, leaned forward and narrowed his eyes at the screen. He looked unsettled. And still, Nadine remained unmoved at the defense table. She didn't watch the screen. She didn't react to the gasps. She only closed the folder in front of her slowly and quietly. Mercer shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Dalton stared straight ahead, unblinking. Jonathan turned to the judge. "This footage," he said, "is only a beginning. We ask the court's patience as we show the full scope of what happened that evening and the pattern that preceded it. Judge Whitfield said nothing for a moment. Her fingers tapped the side of her bench, slow and rhythmic. Finally, she nodded. Proceed, Marnum. And with that, the balance in the courtroom, however, slightly began to tilt. The prosecution looked composed, but there was a strain behind their posture now. The jury wasn't convinced. Not yet, but they were no longer so sure. And that in court is how a tide begins to turn. The courtroom had barely regained its breath from the video when Jonathan Ellery stood once more. We call our next witness, he said, Mrs. Carmen Ellis. A rustle passed through the gallery. From the third bench, a slender woman in her late 60s rose. Dressed in a floral blouse and navy slacks, she clutched a small brown handbag as if it anchored her. Her steps to the stand were slow but sure, the kind of walk that carried stories far older than this courtroom. She was sworn in and Jonathan approached gently, lowering his voice as if out of respect. Mrs. Ellis, could you tell the court where you were on the evening of March 3rd? I was sitting on my porch, she replied, voice soft but clear. Same place, I always sit around that time. I live on Franklin Avenue. Been there 42 years, raised my kids on that street, watched it change. And on that evening, Jonathan continued, did you see Dr. Nadine Rhodes? Carmen nodded slowly. She was walking her little white dog, passed by just before the police cars pulled up. What did you see happen next? The courtroom leaned in. Nadine saw the patrol cars just like I did. We don't get 5 cruisers on our block unless something's wrong. So she went to ask, calm, polite. I heard her say, excuse me, is everything all right here? That's it. No yelling. No attitude, just concern. She paused, eyes glancing over at Nadine. And then Carmen said, voice thickening, next thing I know, they're grabbing her. No warning. No, ma'am, please step back. 1 minute she's asking a question. Next minute, she's slammed onto the hood like she's a threat. A sharp intake of breath came from the audience. One hand clapped, then another. A few people, not many, but enough, broke into quiet applause. Judge Whitfield raised a firm hand. Order, please. No demonstrations in this courtroom. The noise died quickly, but the emotional current didn't. Carmen remained composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Did Dr. Rhodes appear to be resisting arrest in any way, Jonathan asked. No, Carmen said plainly. She looked confused, like she didn't even know why it was happening. She didn't fight back. She just froze. Jonathan nodded, then looked toward the jury. Did anyone speak to you about what you saw that night, Mrs. Ellis? Her lips tightened. No one from the department. Not a single officer, not even after I called and left my number. And did you report what you witnessed? I did. I filed a statement, never got a call back. A few jurors exchanged glances again. The younger man in the third seat, the one who had leaned forward during the video, now sat upright, arms crossed, eyes fixed. Jonathan stepped back. No further questions, Your Honor. Ada Carville rose for cross-examination but hesitated just a breath too long. Her usual rhythm faltered. Mrs. Ellis, she began, you said you were sitting on your porch. How far were you from the patrol car where Dr. Rhodes was detained? About 30 feet clear view. And is your eyesight reliable at that distance? I can read my granddaughter's text messages without glasses, Carmen replied with a hint of bite. A quiet chuckle ran through the room. Even Judge Whitfield's lip twitched. Carville stiffened. Nothing further. As Carmen stepped down, Nadine looked toward her. Their eyes met briefly, and Nadine gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A wordless thank you, a signal of recognition between two women who'd seen more than most knew and survived it. Carmen didn't smile, but her shoulders lifted just slightly as she walked back to her seat. The truth was out, and now it had a voice. The courtroom recessed for a short break, and the gallery emptied into the marbled hallway like a slow-moving tide. Conversations hummed softly, questions hanging in the air like static. No one was saying it outright, but something had shifted. Inside the defense conference room, a modest space tucked beside courtroom 3B, Nadine Rhodes sat alone for a moment, palms resting flat on the table. The stillness around her wasn't peace, it was control. Her phone vibrated once. She didn't hesitate. Dr. Rhodes came the deep, even voice on the other end. Deputy Secretary Alan Voss, Department of Homeland Security. The man who never called unless the stakes were real. I watched the feed, he said, you're handling it well. Nadine said nothing. Voss paused, then added, if things get out of hand, if the prosecution starts weaponizing this trial, you know we'll act. You're not alone. There was a long silence. Then Nadine answered, quiet and firm, I know. A soft knock at the door broke the moment. Imani Blake, her executive assistant, stepped in, late 20s, sharp suit, sharper eyes. She closed the door behind her and leaned in. They're pushing too far, Imani whispered. You've got them on edge. The jury's watching. The press is watching. We could pull rank right now, make one call, and this whole trial folds like wet paper. Nadine looked up. Her gaze wasn't angry, just clear. Imani frowned, ma'am. Let them bury themselves first, Nadine said softly. It's not just about me. She reached for her water bottle and took a sip, her tone composed but her eyes burning with quiet purpose. It's about what happens after. Imani sat back slowly, understanding barely. In the hallway, voices filtered through the door. People whispered Nadine's name now, not just as the accused, but as a question. Who is she really? Why is she so calm? What aren't they telling us? A middle-aged black couple passed by the man, murmuring to his wife. She doesn't act like someone worried about jail. And she wasn't, not because she thought she was invincible, but because she knew exactly what the system looked like from the inside. Back in the courtroom, a cameraman repositioned a tripod. A reporter tapped out notes into her phone, pausing after every few words to glance toward the defense table. The buzz in the air was no longer casual curiosity. It was anticipation. Not all tension comes from shouting. Sometimes it comes from silence that refuses to break. The courtroom was still hushed when Sergeant Raul Trevino took the stand. He didn't carry himself like a man eager to be there. Stocky mid-50s sleeves rolled just enough to hint at long days on the job. His badge glinted under the courtroom lights, but his shoulders looked weighed down by time, by memories, maybe by guilt. Sergeant Trevino, how long have you served in the Westbridge Police Department? 27 years, Trevino said, his voice low but solid. And on the evening of March 3rd, were you called to the scene on Franklin Avenue? I was, he nodded. Got there roughly 5 minutes after the initial radio call. And what did you see when you arrived? Trevino hesitated just a second. Dr. Rhodes was already in custody, he said, cuffed, sitting in the back of a cruiser. Did you witness the arrest yourself? No, only the aftermath. And the officers involved, Sergeant Kyle Mercer and Officer Brent Dalton Trevino, confirmed. Jonathan gave a slight nod. Did you ask them if body cams were rolling during the interaction? I did, Trevino said, first thing I asked, actually. And what was their response? The Sergeant once. They both told me the cameras weren't recording. A ripple moved through the courtroom, faint but undeniable. Jonathan let it settle, then continued. Did they offer a reason? Dalton said his battery died. Mercer claimed his malfunctioned during a firmware update. A few quiet laughs escaped the gallery. The judge gave a warning glance but said nothing. Jonathan pressed on Sergeant Trevino. In your years of service, how often have you encountered both officers on a scene with disabled cameras? Trevino looked directly at the jury now. This is the third time I've seen both cameras off at the same time, he said, and always with the same two officers. That sentence landed like a dropped hammer. The courtroom didn't erupt, but it shifted. Bodies leaned forward, pens hit notepads, eyebrows raised. Even the press row, until now, largely still came alive. Journalists began scribbling frantically, fingers flying across keyboards. A few whispered words passed among reporters like wildfire. Third time, same too. This is big. At the bench, Judge Maureen Whitfield's brow furrowed deeply. It was the first time her composed exterior cracked. She stared down at her notes, but she wasn't reading. She was thinking. Across the aisle, Ada Carville sat frozen. Her pen hovered just above the paper, but didn't move. Behind her, Mercer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, arms crossing defensively. Dalton stared down at the floor like he could melt into it. Jonathan approached the stand again, voice calm but deliberate. Did either officer file a maintenance report on their body cams that evening? Not to my knowledge, Trevino replied. And I checked with the tech division the next day. Nothing had been logged. And what did you personally observe about Dr. Rhodes' demeanor at the scene? She was still, Trevino said slowly. Didn't say much, looked confused but calm. Jonathan nodded once. No further questions. Your Honor. Carville stood, but her movement was slower than usual. Sergeant, she began, is it possible the officers simply encountered coincidental technical failure? Trevino turned to her, measured and blunt. Anything's possible. But after the second time, with the same officers, I stopped believing in coincidence. Carville's lips pressed into a thin line. No further questions. Trevino stepped down. As he passed by the gallery, one woman, the same who had sighed during the video, gave him a subtle nod. Approval, respect. Nadine didn't move, didn't blink. But for the first time, Judge Whitfield glanced toward her and held the stare for just a breath too long. Something unsaid passed between them, and in that moment the court felt it too. The blue wall was cracking, and once a crack begins, it rarely stops. The courtroom had never felt so still. Every shuffle, every whisper, every scribble had faded into silence as Dr. Nadine Rhodes stood and made her way to the witness stand. Her navy suit caught the overhead, light, crisp, and dignified. Her steps were steady, not defiant, deliberate. When she sat, her posture was regal, her chin slightly lifted, eyes calm as water that runs deep. The clerk administered the oath. Nadine raised her hand, spoke each word clearly, and lowered it with a grace that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it anyway. Jonathan Ellery approached the stand slowly. His voice was quieter than before. "Dr. Rhodes," he began, "could you tell the court about your background?" The question hung in the air like a thread stretched tight. Nadine didn't hesitate. "I'm the Secretary of Homeland Security," she said, voice level and unwavering. "I was appointed 6 months ago by the President of the United States." A soft gasp. She continued, eyes fixed ahead. "I oversee federal law enforcement operations, including joint task forces, surveillance programs, border security, and oversight of national policing standards." A second pause. Then she added without shifting her tone, "This includes the jurisdiction within which this courtroom operates." Silence. Real suffocating silence. Then clack, a pen fell from the hand of one of the jurors, a middle-aged man with a bad-shaped keychain hanging from his belt loop. He didn't pick it up, just stared. In the gallery, Mercer's breath caught. His face turned a shade lighter as he leaned toward Dalton and hissed under his breath, "She's lying. She has to be lying." Before Dalton could even nod, a voice thundered from the bench. "Order in the court." Judge Maureen Whitfield's gavel came down hard once, then again. Her voice, usually composed now, carried an unmistakable edge. But it was already too late. The entire room had shifted. Reporters scrambled to verify what they had just heard. Phones buzzed under benches. A legal intern in the press section mouthed the words "Homeland Security" in disbelief. One juror adjusted her glasses twice and finally gave up, just staring blankly at Nadine like she'd just watched history rewrite itself in real time. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't performing. She was simply stating fact of fact that has shattered every assumption this courtroom had been operating under for the past 3 days. Jonathan allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to deepen the weight of her words. Then he continued more gently now. "Dr. Rhodes, were you acting in an official capacity on the evening of March 3rd? I was not. She said I was off duty, but I retain a duty, a legal and moral one, to question improper conduct by any law enforcement officer under federal standards. And in your judgment, was what you witnessed that evening improper?" Nadine's eyes flicked just briefly toward Mercer and Dalton. "Yes," she said, "clearly it was." Across the room, Dalton looked like he might choke. Mercer gripped the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Jonathan nodded. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Whitfield sat frozen for a long moment. Her fingers drummed, once then stopped. She looked down at her notes but didn't move to speak. Because how do you return to normal procedure when the woman on the stand just flipped the courtroom on its head? This was no longer just a local dispute, no longer just about excessive force, no longer just about Nadine Rhodes. This was national. And everyone in the room knew it. The air inside the courtroom had turned thick, not with heat but with consequence. Everything felt heavier now. The walls, the silence, even the name Rhodes seemed to echo with a different gravity. The moment Dr. Nadine Rhodes confirmed her identity, nothing was the same. And now Officer Brent Dalton, the younger of the two arresting officers, was back on the stand. He looked smaller than he had 2 days ago. Gone was the cocky posture. Gone was the smug glance toward the gallery. His uniform, still neatly pressed, seemed to wear him more than he wore it. Jonathan Ellery stood at the lectern again, quiet, unhurried. "Officer Dalton," he began, "I'd like to revisit your earlier testimony, specifically your account of Dr. Rhodes's behavior during the March 3rd incident." Dalton nodded weakly. "Yes, sir. Previously, you stated that Dr. Rhodes approached the officers in a confrontational manner, raised her voice, and refused to step back from a secure perimeter. Do you stand by that statement?" Dalton hesitated. A drop of sweat trickled from his temple. "No," he said, barely audible. "I don't—" A stir in the room. Jonathan pressed gently but firmly. "Would you like to clarify?" Dalton cleared his throat, eyes darting down at his hands, which gripped the edge of the witness stand, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. She didn't yell, he said. She didn't threaten us. She just asked what was going on. And what happened next? Dalton swallowed hard. Sergeant Mercer moved in. I followed. I didn't question it. I helped restrain her. Jonathan took a step closer, his voice softer now when Dalton's breath caught. He looked around the courtroom, then finally reluctantly let his gaze rest on Nadine. She was watching him, not accusing, just watching, and Dalton faltered. I let my bias lead me, he said, his voice cracking. I saw a black woman asking questions, and I assumed the worst. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to see her, I just reacted. A hush swept across the gallery. Dalton lowered his gaze again. And I'm sorry, he added, barely louder than a whisper. I'm sorry, Ms. Rhodes, I really am. The room held its breath. Nadine said nothing. She didn't rise. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink more than usual. But after a moment, a long, still moment, she gave a slow, subtle nod. Not as a gesture of absolution, but as something deeper. A mark of recognition, a signal that she heard him, and that was enough. But not forgetfulness, never that. In the gallery, a black woman with graying braids quietly wiped her cheek with a tissue. A law student in the back row stopped taking notes, overcome. Even Judge Whitfield, ever composed, sat a little straighter. Her expression unreadable, but her hands clasped tighter than before. Jonathan spoke once more. Officer Dalton, is there anything else you'd like the jury to understand? Dalton shook his head. Only that. I thought I was doing my job, but I was protecting the wrong thing. No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of shame, of reckoning, of a room finally beginning to understand just how deep the rot ran. And Nadine, she didn't bask in it. She carried it. The way only someone who had survived it again and again knew how. The jury had been gone only 2 hours, but in courtroom time, it felt like days. The gallery was still full, though no one spoke. Reporters sat poised, pens hovering. Officers lingered near exits, unusually silent. Judge Maureen Whitfield looked more tired than anyone had ever seen her, and Dr. Nadine Rhodes, as always, sat composed, unblinking. The door creaked open. All rise. The jurors filed in one by one, a cross-section of the community, young and old, white and black, quiet and observant. None of them met anyone's eyes. The foreperson, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and a surprisingly emotional tremor in his hands, stood. Judge Whitfield nodded. Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict. He unfolded the paper slowly. The courtroom held its breath. In the matter of Dr. Nadine Rhodes, the officers Kyle Mercer and Brent Dalton of the Westbridge Police Department, on the count of false arrest, we find the defendants guilty. On the count of abuse of power, we find the defendants guilty. On the count of civil rights violations, we find the defendants guilty. The words dropped like stones into water, one after the next, widening the ripple that would become a wave. For a moment, the room was stunned into perfect silence. Then it began. A breath, a gasp, a sabi tidrinimwanshumi, a rustle, and then from the far left bench, a sound so small and pure that it cut through every barrier in the room. Mommy, she's a superhero. The voice belonged to a black girl, no older than 6, her braids tied in pink ribbons. She clung to her mother's waist, eyes wide, voice full of wonder. Her mother smiled through tears, pulling her close. And that broke the dam. Scattered applause, soft weeping. A man in the third row exhaled audibly like he hadn't breathed in 20 years. The courtroom, this old, cold room of echoes and silence, suddenly felt full of life, of heat, of truth. Nadine didn't move. She simply closed her eyes just once and opened them again. Mercer stared straight ahead. Stone-faced Dalton looked down, eyes glistening. Their attorneys leaned in, already whispering about sentencing, about appeals, but no one was listening to them anymore. Not today. Judge Whitfield banged her gavel once, but not harshly. Order. This court recognizes the verdict. Sentencing will be scheduled pending federal review. Court is adjourned. But no one stood, no one moved, because something had shifted, something that couldn't be put back. The girl's words lingered in the air like sacred breath. She's a superhero. But Nadine wasn't wearing a cape. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't seek revenge. She stood in the face of systemic injustice and simply told the truth. For every mother who had prayed, her son wouldn't be next. For every man who had learned to lower his eyes instead of raise his voice, she didn't save the world. She just reminded it that justice still has a heartbeat. The headlines faded quickly, as they always do. Within days, the viral clips and breaking news banners were replaced by newer outrage, fresher scandals. The nation moved on as it tends to, but Nadine Rhodes did not. She returned to Washington with no press conference, no parade, no interviews, just work. Her first act as secretary post-trial was immediate. A federal oversight program for the Westbridge Police Department fully monitored and enforced a 3-year plan, a full audit, mandatory body cam policy reviews, civilian complaint tracking, public reporting. No more shadows. And Nadine made sure she wasn't the one leading it alone. Imani Blake was appointed to oversee the task force, young, relentless, ready. I want them to see a new kind of authority, Nadine had told her, firm, transparent, human. Westbridge would not forget. Neither would its people. When Nadine visited the city 6 weeks later, not a soul in the government building expected her to appear without security, but she walked in alone. Same suit, same calm. Only now there was no mistaking the gravity she carried. She met with new city officials, with community liaisons, with legal staff, but it was her final stop that mattered most. The Mount Gideon Baptist Church. The old wood floors creaked under her heels as she stepped into the back of the sanctuary. Candles glowed, dust danced in beams of light through stained glass. A few volunteers cleaned the pews for Sunday. And there at the altar stood Reverend Elijah Langston, gray-haired now, but still solid in frame and voice. He saw her approach and smiled like he'd known she would come. "I remember when you were 9, he said, voice warm. You used to sit in the second pew, shoulders back, feet barely reaching the floor, listening to sermons like they were state secrets." Nadine chuckled quietly. They were. Langston stepped down and opened his arms. She embraced him. He pulled back and looked her straight in the eye. "You lit the fire, Nadine," he said. "We'll keep it burning." Outside, the wind carried the scent of late spring and sirens in the distance, but for once they didn't sound like fear. Just sound, just life. Later that night, back in her D.C. townhouse, Nadine stood in the quiet of her bathroom, brushing dust from the hem of her blazer. She looked up, and in the mirror for a split second, the light played tricks. She didn't see the Secretary of Homeland Security. She didn't see the woman who had stood in court while a city held its breath. She saw a little black girl, thin, smart, scared, and brave, all at once, standing in an oversized school uniform, her collar slightly crooked, a backpack too big for her shoulders. The girl looked back at her, waiting. Nadine leaned forward, eyes misted but steady, and she whispered, "You made it, now make it count." What Nadine taught us is simple. Real strength speaks quietly and still changes everything. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful stories that matter. Your support keeps us going. It helps us keep telling the truth. One voice, one story at a time. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next chapter.